Sandra Bullock walked into the restaurant alone. Wearing a simple black shirt and jeans, no makeup, no bodyguard, no big entrance. She looked just like any other person, quiet and calm. It was a warm evening in Los Angeles, and she wanted a peaceful meal without any attention. She had been working all day and just needed a place to sit, eat, and relax. The restaurant was fancy, with big glass windows, soft lights, and quiet music. People came here to enjoy expensive food and talk about business or movies. But Sandra didn't want to be noticed. She just wanted to be treated like a normal person. When she walked in, a young waiter near the front looked at her. He was tall, maybe in his 20s, with slick hair and a small name tag. He glanced at Sandra and frowned. He didn't recognize her face. Maybe he thought she was too simple for a place like this. He didn't smile or greet her kindly. He just said, "Table for one." His tone was dry and a little cold. Sandra nodded politely and said yes, but the waiter didn't even make eye contact. He grabbed a menu and walked ahead, without even asking her where she'd like to sit. She followed him quietly. The waiter took her to a table in the far corner, right next to the kitchen doors. It was the worst table in the restaurant, near noise and heat, the kind of table no guest would choose. Sandra said nothing. She just smiled gently and sat down. The waiter placed the menu in front of her without a word and walked away quickly. No welcome, no water, no kindness. He treated her like she was unimportant, like she didn't belong there. Sandra sat still, looked around, and kept calm. She didn't want to make a scene. She had experienced this kind of thing before. She knew how people could judge others by looks, but still, she felt a little hurt inside. This wasn't about being a star. It was about being treated with respect, just like any person deserves. She waited quietly, hoping the service would get better. 15 minutes passed, and the waiter hadn't returned. He was serving other guests, smiling and laughing with people dressed in designer clothes. He brought them drinks and joked with them, but every time he passed Sandra's table, he avoided looking at her. He didn't even notice who she was. He only saw her simple clothes and tired face, and thought she wasn't important. He whispered to a fellow waiter, "Look at her, probably no tip." And they both chuckled quietly. Sandra heard them, but didn't say a word. She sat with her hands in her lap, waiting patiently. She thought about calling another waiter, but didn't want to make a scene. She wanted to believe the young man would realize his mistake, but he didn't. Instead, he kept ignoring her once. She raised her hand slightly to ask for water, but the waiter acted like he didn't see it. She lowered her hand slowly and looked down at her menu again, not reading it, just pretending, trying not to feel disappointed. A couple at the next table looked at Sandra and whispered to each other. The woman took a second glance and said, "That's Sandra Bullock, isn't it?" The man looked again and nodded. "Yeah, I think it is." They didn't say it loudly, but others nearby began to look too. Eyes turned slowly in her direction. People began to notice her face. They had seen her in movies, in interviews, always full of energy and kindness. But now she sat there alone, being treated badly. The mood in the restaurant slowly started to change. Other waiters noticed the whispers. The manager peeked out from the back, trying to understand what was going on. But the main waiter still didn't realize who she was, or maybe he didn't care. He came back to her table finally, without an apology, and said in a bored voice, "Ready to order?" Sandra looked up, smiled politely, and said, "I'd like some water first, please." He nodded slightly and walked away again, still cold, still rude. Sandra leaned back in her chair, trying to stay calm. She had been through a long day, and now, instead of resting, she was being judged and ignored by someone who didn't know anything about her. She wasn't angry. She wasn't going to raise her voice or walk out. She believed in kindness, even when others were not kind. But inside, she felt something break a little. A quiet sadness that someone could be so quick to judge just by a look. She didn't know it yet. But something was about to happen that would change the whole mood in the restaurant. Someone else was about to walk through the same door. Someone who knew exactly who she was, and who didn't care about clothes or makeup or fame, someone who understood respect, and who would not stay silent. And when he walked in, everything would change, and the rude waiter would never forget what came next. But for now, Sandra sat alone, quietly waiting, with grace, patience, and quiet strength. Even in the face of disrespect, she remained the same, gentle and strong, just as she had always been, and always would be. The waiter came back to Sandra's table after a long time, but he didn't bring water. He didn't smile or say sorry for the delay. Instead, he just asked in a bored tone, "What do you want to order?" Sandra looked at the menu and gave her order politely. She said, "I'll have the grilled salmon, please, and a glass of water." The waiter didn't write anything down. He just nodded quickly and walked away. Sandra watched him leave, feeling a little disappointed again. She didn't expect special treatment. She just wanted to be treated like any normal guest. Minutes passed, but the water didn't come. Sandra sat quietly, looking around the restaurant. Other guests were enjoying their meals, talking, laughing. Waiters were moving quickly and serving food with care. The same waiter was smiling at a rich-looking couple sitting near the window. He brought them wine, spoke to them kindly, even pulled out a chair for the lady. Sandra saw all of it, but said nothing. She was used to being quiet in uncomfortable situations. She believed in staying calm no matter what. The waiter passed her table again. Sandra looked up, hoping he would notice her empty glass, but he didn't even glance her way. He walked by like she wasn't there. This happened again and again. It was clear now that he was doing it on purpose. Some of the guests were beginning to notice it. 2. A man sitting across the room whispered to his friend, "Is that really Sandra Bullock? Why is she being ignored like that?" The friend replied, "Maybe the waiter doesn't know who she is, but that wasn't the real problem. Even if she wasn't famous, she still deserved respect." Sandra raised her hand gently and tried to get the waiter's attention again. He looked at her for a second and then turned away to talk to someone else. This time she felt something inside her drop, not because she was a celebrity being treated badly, but because she was a person, and no one deserved to be ignored like this. She had been kind, quiet, and patient, but nothing changed. She didn't want to make a scene, so she folded her hands and kept waiting. The waiter finally brought her food, but he didn't bring the water, and he didn't say a word while placing the plate down. He didn't ask if everything was okay. He just dropped the plate and walked off. Sandra looked at the food. It wasn't even what she ordered. She had asked for grilled salmon, but they gave her a cold chicken dish instead. She stared at the plate for a few seconds, unsure of what to do. Should she say something or just let it go? She took a breath and waited again, hoping someone else might come by. At the back of the restaurant, 2 waiters stood talking near the kitchen. One of them said, "She doesn't look like someone who can afford to eat here," the other replied. "Probably just wants to sit here and take pictures." They both laughed quietly. Not knowing Sandra could hear them, those words didn't hurt her pride. They hurt her heart, because she had come here with kindness and trust. And instead, she was being treated like she was invisible. A family sitting nearby was watching the whole thing. The father leaned toward his daughter and said, "That woman is Sandra Bullock, the movie star," the daughter replied. "Why is that waiter being so mean to her?" The father shook his head slowly. "Sometimes people judge too fast," he said. More people in the restaurant were now recognizing her face. Soft whispers moved from table to table. Eyes turned toward her. People began to see the truth, but still, the waiter didn't notice or didn't care. Sandra didn't try to fix the mistake with the food. She didn't complain or raise her voice. She just moved the plate slightly and waited. Her calm face showed no anger, only quiet sadness. She thought about how many others had felt this way, judged too quickly, ignored without reason. She wondered how often it happened to people who didn't have a famous face. Maybe people just wanted to feel seen, to be treated with kindness, even for a short time. Another server passed by and paused. She looked at Sandra's plate and asked gently, "Excuse me, is everything all right?" Sandra smiled and replied, "Actually, I had ordered the salmon, and I'm still waiting for water." The server looked surprised and nodded quickly. "I'll fix it right away," she said, and rushed off. This small moment felt like a drop of light in the middle of a cloudy day. At least someone cared enough to notice. Meanwhile, the rude waiter was still talking to guests, laughing and acting like nothing was wrong. He had no idea that the woman he was ignoring was not only a world-famous actress, but also someone deeply loved by fans for her kindness, humility, and heart. And soon, someone was going to walk through the restaurant doors. Someone who did know who Sandra was. Someone who would not ignore what was happening. Someone who would change the entire mood of the evening and remind everyone what true respect looked like. For now, Sandra sat quietly, waiting not for revenge, but for kindness. And kindness was on its way. Just a few steps away from the front door, Sandra sat at the table, still waiting for water. The wrong dish was in front of her, and her heart was a little heavy. She had been patient, she had been kind, but the waiter had shown her nothing but coldness. Still, she didn't complain. She didn't raise her voice or cause a scene. She believed in staying calm and graceful, even when things weren't fair. Her eyes looked around the restaurant, and slowly, she began to notice something strange happening. People were looking at her, not with judgment, but with surprise. Whispers floated through the air like soft waves. Someone said, "I think that's Sandra Bullock." Another voice said, "No way, she wouldn't be sitting here like this." And then someone else added, "I'm sure it's her. I've seen her in movies." A couple sitting nearby turned to stare. The woman leaned over to her husband and said quietly, "Look at her face, it's really her." He nodded, his eyes wide. "What is she doing here alone?" He whispered. The whispers spread from table to table. People were beginning to realize that the quiet woman sitting alone wasn't just another customer. She was a famous actress, loved by millions, known for her kindness and talent. But tonight, she was being treated like a nobody, and people were noticing the unfairness. They watched as the waiter continued to ignore her, laughing with other customers and giving her no attention. A man sitting at the far side of the room opened his phone and searched her name. He turned it around to show his wife, and they both looked again at Sandra's face. "It's really her," the wife whispered. "Why isn't she being treated better?" The man shook his head. "Because the waiter doesn't know who she is. Or maybe he doesn't care," he said softly. More and more people in the restaurant were now staring at Sandra, their eyes filled with respect and curiosity. The waiter still didn't see what was happening. Or maybe he chose to ignore it. He walked past Sandra's table again. But this time, he looked a little nervous. He saw people pointing, whispering, looking at him and then at Sandra. For a moment, he paused, and then rolled his eyes. Probably just another fan trying to act like a celebrity. He muttered under his breath and walked away quickly. Sandra heard him, but once again, she said nothing. She simply adjusted her chair and looked out the window. She was used to attention in public, but not like this. This was different. This wasn't fans asking for pictures. This was quiet support. People who had seen the disrespect and felt uncomfortable. Strangers who didn't even know her personally were now beginning to feel something wasn't right. The air in the restaurant started to shift. The smiles on faces became smaller, and the laughter faded a little. People didn't like what they were witnessing. A young couple at the next table wanted to say something. The man leaned forward and whispered, "Ma'am, are you okay?" Sandra smiled gently and nodded. "Thank you, I'm fine," she said softly. They didn't push her further, but they stayed alert, watching how she was being treated. A woman across the room picked up her phone and quietly started recording. She didn't plan to post it right away, but she felt the moment needed to be remembered, not for drama, but as a lesson in how easily people can misjudge others. One of the older waiters noticed the growing attention. He walked to the manager and whispered, "I think we've made a mistake." The manager looked confused. "What do you mean?" The waiter pointed at Sandra. "That's Sandra Bullock," he said. The manager's eyes widened, and he immediately began to walk toward her table. But something stopped him. The front door opened, and someone else walked in. Someone who changed everything with just his presence. But before that happened, before the next moment arrived, the room was already full of tension. It wasn't loud or angry. It was quiet, thick, and heavy. People were watching. Not because she was a movie star, but because they saw someone being mistreated. And they didn't like it. And Sandra, sitting with her back straight and her face calm, remained the picture of patience. She didn't let the whispers distract her. She didn't let the stares bother her. She just waited, holding on to her dignity like a light in the dark. Even with all the eyes now on her, she didn't change. She didn't try to act different. She stayed kind, peaceful, and strong. And that strength was what touched the people around her the most. They weren't impressed by her fame. They were moved by her grace, by how she handled unfairness without becoming unkind. And just when it seemed the night would stay the same, the sound of the door opening brought a new wave of silence. Someone had just entered. Someone who knew exactly who she was, and who wouldn't let the disrespect go on any longer. That moment was just a few seconds away, and it would change everything in the room. Forever, the restaurant had become quiet. The whispers had spread across every table. Almost everyone knew now that the woman sitting alone was Sandra Bullock. Some had seen her in movies. Some had read about her in magazines. But no one expected to see her here. Sitting quietly, eating a wrong order, without even a glass of water. The atmosphere felt strange, not loud, but full of silent tension. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The waiter who had treated her badly still didn't understand what was going on. He noticed people staring, but he thought maybe they were just surprised to see someone dressed so simply in a fancy place. He didn't realize the crowd had recognized her, or maybe he still refused to believe it. Someone had even told him quietly, "That's Sandra Bullock," but he laughed and said, "Yeah, right. She wouldn't come here looking like that," and walked away like nothing mattered. Then, something changed. The front door of the restaurant opened again, and a man walked in. Tall, calm, and dressed in simple black jeans and a t-shirt. He wore no sunglasses. No bodyguard followed him. Yet the moment he stepped inside, heads turned. People gasped quietly. Phones slipped into pockets. Eyes went wide. Because this wasn't just any man. It was Keanu Reeves. He looked around the restaurant with his usual calm face. Then his eyes found Sandra sitting at the table in the corner. His expression softened into a warm smile. Without waiting for anyone to greet him, he walked across the room. Not in a rush, but with purpose. Every step he took made people whisper again. Now the room wasn't just filled with curiosity. It was filled with awe. Two movie legends were now in the same place. But something else was about to happen. Something no one expected. The waiter stood frozen for a moment when he saw Keanu approaching Sandra. He looked confused, as if trying to figure out why the famous actor was walking toward the woman he had just ignored and insulted. Keanu reached the table and gently placed his hand on Sandra's shoulder. "Hey," he said with a soft smile. "Sorry I'm late." Sandra looked up and smiled warmly. "You're just on time," she replied. The room seemed to stop moving for a moment. People watched without blinking. The same woman who had been treated so poorly was now talking like an old friend with one of the most beloved actors in the world. And Keanu didn't just sit down. He looked at the table, noticed the wrong dish, and the missing water. Then he turned and looked straight at the waiter, who was now standing nearby with a red face. "Is this how you treat your guests?" Keanu asked in a calm but serious voice. The waiter tried to smile. I didn't know who she was," he said quietly. But Keanu's eyes didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. But his words felt stronger than any shout. "You don't have to know someone to treat them with respect," he said slowly. His tone was steady, his message clear. The waiter opened his mouth, but no words came out. The manager rushed forward. Now realizing the full picture, he apologized again and again, trying to explain. But Keanu simply raised his hand and said, "It's not about who she is. It's about how she was treated." Sandra didn't say a word. She just watched quietly, letting Keanu speak. She didn't need to add anything. Her silence spoke louder than words. Keanu sat down across from her and called for another server. "Can we get her the order she asked for, please?" "And a glass of water," he said kindly. The new server nodded quickly and rushed to fix everything. Around the restaurant, people were nodding. Some even smiled with relief. It felt like justice had arrived. Not with anger, but with calm strength. The waiter who had been rude looked down at the floor. He knew he had made a huge mistake, not just because she was famous, but because he had judged someone without kindness, and now, the whole restaurant had seen it. He walked away slowly. Not knowing what to say, Keanu didn't insult him. He didn't make a big show, but his words stayed in the air like a quiet lesson. Sandra and Keanu began talking like old friends, laughing softly, enjoying each other's company. People went back to their meals, but the energy had changed. Respect had been restored. Kindness had returned, and everyone in the room felt it. The quiet strength of their presence reminded everyone of something simple yet powerful: treat every person with respect, not because of who they are, but because kindness is always the right choice. That evening, the story of what happened started to spread beyond the restaurant. Someone posted about it online. People shared it again and again, not for drama or gossip, but because it was real, honest, and human. And it showed that even in a world full of fame and pride, humility, kindness, and quiet courage still shine the brightest. And that one moment, one voice, can change everything, just like Keanu did. With a few calm words and a kind heart, Keanu Reeves sat down at the table with Sandra Bullock. His presence filled the room with calm power. He didn't have to raise his voice, and he didn't have to say anything dramatic. Just being there changed everything. Sandra smiled at him, her eyes full of quiet relief. She didn't need to explain anything. Keanu had already understood everything with just one look at the table. The wrong food, the empty glass, and the tired expression on her face told him the full story. Keanu looked around the restaurant, not with anger, but with quiet awareness. The people who had been watching from their tables were still whispering. They were amazed by what was happening. Two Hollywood stars, sitting together like old friends. But even more than that, they were touched by the simple kindness Keanu had shown. He didn't yell. He didn't demand special treatment. He just sat down beside someone who had been treated badly, and treated her the way every person should be treated, with respect. A new waiter came over, different from the one who had ignored Sandra before. This new server was polite and nervous. He asked if everything was okay now. Keanu smiled kindly and said, "She ordered grilled salmon and a glass of water. Could you please bring that for her?" The server nodded quickly and ran off, trying to fix the mistake as fast as possible. The other staff members were now working more carefully too. The whole restaurant felt different, like the room had taken a deep breath and remembered how to be human again. Keanu leaned forward slightly and spoke to Sandra in a soft voice. "I'm really sorry this happened," he said. Sandra just smiled and shook her head. "It's not your fault," she replied. "You being here made it better." They both laughed gently. It was clear they had known each other for a long time. Their friendship wasn't just about movies or fame. It was about trust, about understanding how the world can be unfair, and how important it is to stay kind, no matter what. Other diners watched with admiration, not because Sandra and Keanu were celebrities, but because they acted like real people, humble, gentle, and full of quiet strength. A woman at a nearby table whispered to her husband, "They're amazing." Not because they're famous, but because they didn't act like they were better than anyone else. The man nodded. "This is what real class looks like," he said. The waiter who had treated Sandra badly stayed in the back of the restaurant. He couldn't face her now. His hands were shaking, and his mind was full of regret. He had judged her too quickly. Without knowing anything about her, he had looked at her simple clothes and thought she didn't matter. Now he realized how wrong he had been, and the whole restaurant had seen his mistake. He wished he could go back and do things differently. The manager approached Keanu and Sandra's table. Slowly, He looked nervous but sincere. "I want to apologize again," he said softly. "This should not have happened." Keanu looked at him and nodded. "I understand," he replied. "Just remind your staff that everyone deserves kindness, not just people you recognize," the manager agreed quickly, his face full of shame. "It won't happen again," he promised. Sandra looked up and said gently, "It's okay, really. I just wanted to have dinner like a regular person." Her voice was kind, and her eyes were soft. She wasn't angry. She just wanted people to learn from what had happened and maybe treat others better next time. Her calm response made the manager feel even more guilty, because she had every right to be upset, but instead, she chose forgiveness. The new server returned with the correct order and a glass of water. He placed it carefully on the table and said, "I hope everything is perfect now." Sandra thanked him warmly and began to eat, finally getting the meal she had ordered from the start. Keanu sipped from his own glass and relaxed in his chair. The two friends talked quietly, sharing stories and laughter like nothing had happened. But everyone in the restaurant knew something important had just taken place. This moment wasn't just about a waiter being rude or a star being recognized. It was about something deeper. It was about how easy it is to judge people based on how they look, and how powerful it is to stand up quietly for what's right. Keanu didn't need to shout. Sandra didn't need to cry. Their quiet presence was enough to remind everyone around them what respect really means. And even though they didn't say it out loud, their actions spoke clearly. True kindness doesn't depend on who you are or how famous you are. It lives in how you treat people, in the small, silent choices you make every day. In a world full of noise, their silence had spoken the loudest, and it had changed everything, not just for one meal, but for everyone watching, who would never forget what they had seen that night. Keanu sat across from Sandra, speaking to her with gentle words and a calm smile. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to say much. His actions were already speaking louder than anything. He was kind, respectful, and fully focused on making sure Sandra was okay. Sandra looked more relaxed now. She was eating her food slowly and sipping the glass of water that finally arrived. It had taken too long, but now things were starting to feel better. People in the restaurant were no longer whispering as much. Many of them had turned their attention back to their meals, but the feeling in the room had changed. The air was softer, more respectful. The other staff members were now walking more carefully, smiling politely at all the guests. Something about Keanu's quiet strength had reminded them all that kindness matters. It wasn't about who was rich or famous. It was about being a good human. The young waiter who had been rude stayed hidden near the kitchen. He was watching from a distance, his face pale. He kept thinking about how badly he had behaved, not just toward a movie star, but toward a woman who had done nothing wrong. He remembered the words Keanu had spoken. "You don't have to know someone to treat them with respect." Those words stayed in his head like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. He thought about how he had judged her the moment she walked in, just because she looked simple, just because she didn't wear fancy clothes or act like a celebrity. He had laughed, whispered rude things, and ignored her completely. Now he felt ashamed. Not because she turned out to be famous, but because he realized he had been wrong to treat anyone like that. Famous or not, people deserve to be treated kindly. That was something he would never forget. Keanu looked around the restaurant and noticed the waiter in the corner. Their eyes met for just a moment, and the waiter quickly looked down, afraid to face him. Keanu didn't glare or frown. He simply nodded once, a small signal that said, "I see you." It wasn't a look of anger, it was a look of understanding. Keanu knew the boy had learned something, and that was enough for him. The manager returned to the table, holding a small tray with a dessert. "This is on the house," he said quietly. "Just a small way to say sorry again." Sandra smiled and said thank you. She didn't need the dessert, but she accepted it kindly. She had forgiven them already, not because they deserved it, but because she believed in letting go. She believed in showing grace even when others didn't. Keanu picked up a spoon and shared a bite of the dessert with Sandra. They both laughed softly, remembering old memories. Their friendship had lasted many years through movies, events, and real-life ups and downs, and today, it had shown its strength again, not by doing something big, but by doing something small, by simply showing up when it mattered most. A young girl at one of the nearby tables walked up to their table slowly, holding a small piece of paper and a pen. "Excuse me," she said shyly. "Can I please have your autograph?" Sandra looked at her and smiled warmly. "Of course," she said, and signed the paper, then handed it to Keanu, who also signed it with a quiet smile. The girl beamed with joy and ran back to her family. The whole room felt lighter after that. It was a simple moment, but a sweet one. The waiter who had made the mistake finally walked toward the table, his steps slow, his head low. He stood beside them and said softly, "I'm really sorry for how I treated you." His voice was shaking. Sandra looked up at him, her face calm. "Thank you," she said gently. "I accept your apology," Keanu added. "The important thing is that you understand why it was wrong." The waiter nodded. "I do," he said. "I was wrong. And I've learned something today." Sandra smiled again. Not because she wanted to show forgiveness, but because she truly meant it. She believed in second chances. She had made mistakes in her life too, and she knew everyone deserved a chance to grow. The waiter walked away feeling both embarrassed and grateful. He would never forget this day. It would stay with him forever. Keanu and Sandra finished their meal peacefully, talking and laughing like two friends who had been through a small storm and come out stronger. Other guests in the restaurant had watched the entire thing happen, and many of them left with something new in their hearts. It wasn't just a story about two celebrities. It was a lesson, a reminder that kindness doesn't cost anything, but it means everything. By the time they stood up to leave, the restaurant had become quiet again, not in an awkward way, but in a thoughtful way. People smiled at them, some nodded respectfully, others just watched silently. Keanu and Sandra walked to the door side by side, no loud goodbyes, no attention-seeking. Just two friends leaving together with quiet dignity, and behind them, they left more than just empty chairs. They left behind a powerful example of what respect, patience, and kindness really look like, and that quiet lesson would stay in that restaurant long after they were gone. Like a soft light that never fades, the young waiter stood near the kitchen door, his hands shaking. He had just said sorry to Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves, and even though they forgave him, he still felt ashamed. He couldn't stop thinking about how rude he had been. He remembered how he ignored Sandra, how he whispered bad things about her, and how he gave her the worst table without even smiling. He had judged her too quickly, just because she didn't look rich or famous, and now, that mistake would stay with him forever. But something inside him had changed, seeing the way Sandra had smiled, even after everything, and the way Keanu spoke with calm strength had touched his heart. They didn't yell. They didn't insult him. They didn't try to embarrass him in front of everyone. Instead, they showed him something more powerful: kindness and grace. The kind that makes a person think, really think, and that's what he was doing now. Thinking deeply about who he wanted to be, he walked back into the dining area and began serving the other customers with more care. This time he smiled. He looked them in the eye, and he said, "Thank you, and please." The other guests noticed the change. One woman even said, "It's good to see you smiling." And he replied softly, "I'm learning." He didn't say more, but in his heart, he knew this day had become a lesson he would carry forever. Meanwhile, Sandra and Keanu finished their meal. They sat back in their chairs, relaxed and calm. The table now felt warm, full of quiet joy and peace. They had gone through an uncomfortable moment, but they had turned it into something good, something meaningful. Keanu took a sip of water and looked around the restaurant. People were still watching them, not with loud voices or cameras, but with quiet respect. The manager walked over again, this time more relaxed. "Thank you both," he said. You didn't just teach my staff something important. You reminded all of us about real class." Sandra smiled kindly. "We all have bad days," she replied. "What matters is what we learn from them." Keanu nodded. "Exactly," he said. "It's never too late to do better." The manager looked truly grateful and promised to speak with his whole team about what had happened. At that moment, something special happened. The rude waiter, still nervous, slowly walked back to their table again, this time holding a folded note in his hand. He looked down and said, "I wrote something, if that's okay." Sandra looked up, surprised but gentle. "Of course," she said. He placed the note on the table and quickly walked away, too shy to say more. Keanu picked up the note and opened it, then handed it to Sandra. She read it quietly, and her eyes softened. The note said, "I judged you by your clothes, and I treated you without respect. I didn't know who you were, but now I understand that doesn't matter. I'm sorry, not because you are famous, but because you are a person, and every person deserves kindness. Thank you for showing me that without shouting or fighting. I'll remember this for the rest of my life." Sandra folded the note slowly and placed it in her purse. Keanu smiled at her. "That's a start," he said. Sandra nodded. "Yes, it is," she whispered. Both of them knew that the waiter had truly understood his mistake. And more than that, he wanted to change. That meant more than any public apology. It meant growth. And that's what really mattered. As Sandra and Keanu stood up to leave, the room became silent again. People didn't clap or cheer, but their faces showed respect and admiration, not for two celebrities, but for two kind human beings. Sandra walked slowly toward the exit, Keanu beside her. They didn't look back for attention. They just walked quietly, smiling at a few faces, waving gently at the little girl who had asked for an autograph earlier. When they stepped outside, the cool evening air greeted them. The sky was soft with fading light, and the world outside the restaurant felt calmer, lighter. Keanu looked at Sandra and said, "You handled that better than anyone else could." She laughed gently. "I've had practice," she said. They both laughed, and for a moment, it felt like all the stress of the evening had disappeared. Back inside the restaurant, the staff stood in silence for a moment. The manager spoke softly. "Let's remember this," he said. "Let's treat every guest with the same respect, no matter how they look." The young waiter nodded, tears almost in his eyes. He knew he would never make the same mistake again. From that night forward, the restaurant changed. The waiters smiled more, they listened better, and they stopped judging people by appearances. And whenever someone told the story of the night Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves came in, they didn't focus on fame or photos. They talked about kindness, humility, and how one simple moment of respect can change everything. Sandra and Keanu didn't plan to become part of someone's life lesson that night. They just wanted dinner and peace, but their quiet actions lit a small fire of change. Not with big speeches, but with calm, gentle strength. And that made all the difference. It became a memory people would never forget. A story passed on, not for gossip, but for goodness.